And right now, Jen joins me from her secret quarantine bunker. Hi, Jen. How are you today?
I miss you guys. Hey, by the way, everything I learned about set design, I learned from you guys at Liquid Lunch. So here we are.
What? Everything you learned about what?
Set design
Oh yeah. you
and
put
other things.
you used one of my brother Derek's old techniques. Put
I
some
did. In
put
fact,
some wood.
before we all went under lockdown, I had many conversations with Big D about what to do as a backdrop. I have a special project coming up next month, and what you see behind me, is a culmination of those thoughts. Never thought I would have to actually build it alone, but that's the new reality we're all living in. And I brought my liquid lunch here for you.
Oh, baby, there we go. Okay, so Jen, all
Little
right,
Cheetos.
yeah, we miss you too, but um, I spy some laminate flooring on the wall, me personally, or something that looks like laminate flooring, because I know that's one of Derek's techniques. But it sure does seem that a lot of us are, expanding our skill sets under the quarantine mode here.
Yeah.
And once upon a time, in a land far, far away, single JT had a wonderful lady named Rosa who came to his house every Monday and cleaned and sparkled and shined and mopped and cleaned and disinfected and did laundry. And Rosa, for the time being, is on halt. She hasn't been here in a month. And,
Yeah.
and even in the beginning stages, I had some of the staff here in the house, and intermittently I've had, a few people come by, socially distanced, sit out in the yard, but predominantly men. And for some reason, I decided today that I could no longer look at my completely white guest bathroom in its condition, and got out all these tools that I've seen laying around the house from Rosa, like this brush that goes in the toilet bowl and this scrubber thing and the mopping items. And I can't believe now that I know how badly men can miss a toilet bowl. Um, but you'd
How
be shocked.
disgusting you are.
You'd be shocked how sparkling white my bathroom is now after putting on my mask and gloves. But it's a crazy new normal, Jen.
It is. I colored my own hair last night. It was
And
the
it looks
first.
wonderful.
Thank you, thank you. It was the first time since college that I've done that myself. So yeah, it's interesting times, and when we get back to it, as hopefully we will very soon. I'll be interested to see tomorrow when President Trump um, announces exactly who is going to be on this task force to reopen America. I think there'll be some interesting names on there, and they'll be guiding us through the next, several weeks, and maybe even several months, as we get back to quote unquote the new normal, and start moving about the country, and connecting business again, which is what America greatly needs.
Well, Jen, I know it's no time for politics, and you're here in New York, but I think New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo has really been doing a heck of a job trying to keep the politics out of it. And I know you and I don't typically agree with the politics of this guy, and he's making up some ground, tricking people that he's not as progressive as he is. But I tend to feel like he's standing up well as somebody you could believe that he's at least giving you the straight dope on the disease.
Yeah, for sure. I've been a big fan of his throughout the coronavirus crisis. And, he sure is doing a lot better job than Joe Biden, who on any given day, when he appears on TV, he looks like, the old grandpa leaning into the Zoom, trying to figure out, how to work it, how to mute things, how to work the teleprompter. I think this is a real problem for Joe Biden, because it shows that there are actually some strong governors out there in the Democratic Party, and that maybe the Democratic establishment should not have rushed to appoint Joe Biden as their nominee. And I think things are going to get really interesting. It'll be actually interesting, John, to see if the Democratic convention even happens. That starts July 13th. as it sits today, but it's hard to imagine a scenario in which 10,000 people can come together at a convention like that when the major sporting uh, arenas are not even reopened. So this could actually get pretty tricky for Joe Biden here. You could see Cuomo really knocking at that back door. But I will say this in President Trump's defense. I even think that Cuomo really would not quite, as much as I like him and the job he's done in coronavirus, much of the things that Andrew Cuomo can actually boast about, having enough equipment, having enough PPE, so on and so forth, have actually been provided by the Trump administration and by FEMA under the direction of President Donald Trump. So I think when you put the spreadsheets out, side by side, I think those will sort of crumble. But there's no doubt about it. He is a great communicator. He would be a fantastic candidate instead of Joe Biden. But how the Democratic Party is going to thread that needle, I think that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And one of the things that I was referring to and saying how I thought he was leaving politics out of this, if he was a different type of person, human overall, he could be the recipient of all this federal aid, but still be on television pandering to his base, talking about how he's not getting everything he needs. And, he's not
Right.
doing that. He's actually,
Right.
from what I hear and see just on the street level, he's actually pissing off people that would typically be in his base because they say he's being too nice to Trump and they want him to stop being so complimentary. And I think there's been a couple times he's pulled a punch here or there and he's, got in a couple of shots on the Donald, but for the most part, he's circled back and been, one of the things that he's horrible on, Jen, that I know you want to talk is he's given out some really crazy, cockeyed, confusing guidance on the use of hydroxychloroquine. And you know about a study down in Texas where one doctor's used it on 30 people and had some phenomenal results.
Right.
What's happening?
Yeah. This is a guy, a medical director, an MD, doctor of a nursing home. He just happens to be the former vice chair of the Texas GOP, who I have a great relationship with. And look, he was presiding over a nursing home in which I think 86 of the residents struck down with coronavirus. And so when he was looking around at how are you going to treat a mass amount of senior citizens, some very elderly and in very fragile conditions, how are you going to ensure you don't have 86 deaths at a single nursing home? I mean, that would have been a horrific headline. Even President Trump has called nursing homes. Sorry, my dog's under the desk. Rattling around in case you wonder what that sound is. But imagine the headline if you had had 86 senior citizens die in a single nursing home. I mean, this is what President Trump was referring to as nursing homes getting the nickname death traps. And so you have this enterprising young doctor, Dr. Robin Armstrong, down in Texas, who took matters into his own hands. And he contacted Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick down in Texas. And he said, hey, I heard the president talking about this hydroxychloroquine. I want to try it. Can you see if, FEMA or someone will send some down? And they did. And he administered this to 27 patients. And they are all, to this day, they have survived and are not only surviving, but thriving on the drug. And of course, Rolling Stone magazine and a bunch of lefty publications making fun of him, saying, he was relying on the medical advice of President Donald Trump. But when it comes down to it, those are 27 grandmas that people were able to keep on Easter and enjoy Easter weekend with. And those were, 27 Americans that were able to live because of something that the president had read up on and studied. And I think instead of making fun of that, we ought to celebrate that. And this doctor, he makes a great case. He says, look, is it risky to put senior citizens on this drug? Sure, but not if they're under the guidance of a medical doctor, and not if they're under very careful attention of a medical doctor. And that's exactly what President Trump said all along, is that you should be on this if you have a doctor who can monitor your symptoms and monitor your heart rate and all the other things. And the nursing home was the perfect place for that to happen because the doctor's there at all times. So that's a really great case, I think, that people will look to after this is over with. And I think the data will be actually very, very interesting to look at after this is over with, John, because we're going to see some cases where that was used by liberal physicians. I think there are going to be a lot of stories after the physicians can come out of these ERs and kind of take a breath after this is over with. They're going to share some stories, I think, that are going to be pretty compelling.
Jen, this may sound weird coming from me, but I wouldn't say that I'm a advocate of either pro-life or pro-choice in any stated way politically. I think, there's some things the government should stay out of. I have my own religious feelings on it, but where are all these liberal folks who are pro-choice marching around with vaginas on their head? Women's right to choose. Where are the pro-choice folks saying, let people choose if they want to use hydroxychloroquine and suffer the lack of clinical trials and the side effects? Let people choose. If I understand it and I'm dying, why don't they let me choose? If it's allowed to be used off-label for arthritis and lupus, I want it. Why? Where are the advocates for human beings' choice? I don't see it.
Right. And that's such a great point. And, Democrats always say that Republicans and President Trump don't believe in science. Well, can you imagine a scenario in which Donald Trump might have heard about this drug, hydroxychloroquine, a month ago and didn't pass it on to the public, didn't pass it on to physicians as something they ought to look into? I mean, we would never hear the end of it. But now, since he did that, it's grounds for some sort of ridicule. And you're right. The choice here is really comes down to the relationship between the patient and their doctor. And again, I think the data is going to be really interesting. You look at New York State. I think there's no coincidence that New York State was sent 3,000 doses of hydroxychloroquine, and within 2 weeks of that being delivered on March 24th, we had an immediate reduction in hospitalizations and people having to be placed on ventilators. And the more serious cases had a serious decline, as did the death rates now. And I think we'll look back on that and see the date that it was delivered, March 24th, and the 2 weeks that followed that. I think it's going to be significant. And numbers don't lie, whether it's poll numbers. I've lived and died at the ballot box for 15 years. You've lived and died by the numbers on Wall Street.
That's right.
The numbers don't lie.
No.
And if the physicians and the medical providers are honest about this afterward, we'll be able to see the data pretty clearly. Who was on it, who survived after being on it, who was put on a ventilator after it. They're saying now that people who have been placed on it have been spared the dramatic consequence of having to even be put on a ventilator, and that's pretty significant. So we'll see. I think the numbers will tell an interesting story.
Yep, like you always tell us, many interesting stories. The one great number I saw today from Cuomo when he was talking about, unfortunately 600 some odd people died, but that's a decrease in the growth of the deaths, which is, fortunate. That means there might be some significance. But he said the 3-day average of net hospital admissions was down. So meaning the hospital admissions was up, but the amount of people recovering and being released was up greater. So it was like the first day where they had a negative number on there. And, being, like you said, the numbers don't lie.
Right.
That doesn't mean, hey, everyone's great tomorrow. But if we could see the velocity of that continue to the downside, then these are probably some early warnings that we might be heading to some calmer waters.
Yep. I agree. And look, I think there are some after reports already being done. I think they're a little premature. Piece I'm working on for tomorrow for the Daily Caller or the Hill is this notion that somehow because you've had this high increase in African American communities, the Louisiana governor just an hour or so ago said he's going to set up health equality task force. And trust me, there are going to be a lot of liberal programs coming out of this that have to show that we have to study this issue. And while those deaths might be a result of income inequality and things like that, there might be a genetic reason why certain parts of the population are succumbing to this. And for example, it hits men harder than it hits women. Well, why is that? We need some genetic testing that really shows what those numbers are. And the piece I'm working on for tomorrow actually talks about why hospitals didn't have the PPE that they needed. And it's because Democrat governors declined the purchase of them. That's part of the story. But the other part of the story, John, is Obamacare changed the way that hospitals received funding. So Barack Obama, in his infinite wisdom as a community organizer, put in place a lot of community health centers. And guess what? That drew away resources from hospitals. And I think that's the reason we're seeing the big tragedy that we're seeing at hospitals, where people are waiting on gurneys and emergency rooms at hospitals for 80 hours to get a hospital bed and dying in the waiting room. I can trace it back to Obamacare. So I think that's going to be a big story tomorrow as we go.
All right. Thank you, Jen. You're the best. Thank you for hooking up with us on short notice. You're the bomb. And I can't tell you when it's going to be, but I can't wait till we get back to a real liquid lunch in person. So much more fun.
I know. I was going to say, I probably won't shake hands with many people after this is over with, but I can't wait to hug you. And we'll see you guys soon.